So good evening, everybody. My name is Jan Joosten. I'm a partner at this law firm. So on behalf of Baker McKenzie, welcome. In my spare time, I am also the chairman of the Netherlands America Foundation. So on behalf of the NAF, welcome to this event. This is a very special event and in many ways an experiment. I guess tomorrow is our 31st, the 29th, Peter Stuyvesant Ball? 36th. Yeah, geez, I should get my numbers right beforehand. Anyhow, so it has always been a great party, and we hope to see you all there. But for the first time ever, we are organizing a seminar the night before, trying to combine a business event with the Peter Stuyvesant Ball so that you have even a better reason to attend both events. And if you're traveling, for example, from the Netherlands, so that you have a good reason to come to New York and you can tell your boss or the tax man or whomever that you had a valid business reason to be in New York because you had to go to this very important seminar, and then there was also the ball where you were in New York anyhow, so you might as well attend that. So it's an experiment which I hope you like. We have some very distinguished speakers and very distinguished guests. As you have noticed, perhaps some guests are not here. Princess Margriet and Professor van Vollenhoven are unfortunately not here. They had hoped to be here tonight and they had hoped to be at the ball tomorrow night, but unfortunately Professor van Vollenhoven had to undergo a simple but urgent medical procedure, which he'll have tomorrow. So they couldn't come over, they had to cancel, unfortunately. But we are told that this is a relatively simple procedure, so he should be fine, and hopefully they'll be here next year. So that was one curveball that was thrown at us yesterday morning. The other curveball is that one of our speakers, Professor Lex Hoogduin, all of a sudden was urgently needed elsewhere. So he couldn't attend either. The good news is that he did tape his message for us, so you'll see that in a moment. So those are some surprises that we had to deal with, but I think we managed them very well. So our lineup now is that instead of Professor Hoogduin, we'll have Bart van Ark here. Bart, where are you? Most people will know Bart. Bart is a graduate of Groningen University, and Groningen University is co-sponsoring this event, by the way. So thank you, Bart, for jumping in here. He is the chief economist at the conference board, and I understand has quickly become very knowledgeable on the subject. But he will be presenting together with Dr. Roland Kupers, who is sitting right in front here, and he was on your invitation. And he is an independent consultant on complexity, resilience, and energy transition, as well as an associate fellow at Oxford University, a visiting professor at Singapore Management University, and executive lecturer at Nyenrode Business University. And this entire event will be, what is the right word? Moderated. Did you have a better word, Madeleine? Hosted. I think moderated. I'll go for moderated. So by Madeleine van Nieuwenhuizen. And Madeleine is a NAF Fulbright alumna. So that means that she got a Fulbright fellowship from us a number of years ago. So this is the result of all of our hard work to raise money for Fulbright Fellows. She is at Columbia University pursuing an MA in American Studies with a focus on American political history and foreign policy. And I'm not going to tell everybody your degrees because people got the invite. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event, and I'll hand the mic over to Madeleine.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event this evening. So my name is Madeleine. I'm a Fulbright Fellow at Columbia University, and I was asked to host this evening, or moderate, if you will. And it was funny because I Googled the term, and it's not my specialty. So I Googled the term, as one does. And I started thinking about how it would apply to my own field of studies. So my own field of studies focuses on political history, and actually I shifted a bit from foreign policy more to the realm of law. And I'm graduating next month, and I'm writing my dissertation on hate speech and on freedom of speech and the way in which governments regulate speech. The United States has the most robust free speech doctrine in the world, and so I'm comparing it to Western notions of free speech. And why I'm telling this is because if we think of complexity theory as having to do with complex policies that are informed from basically by different angles, it's something that I'm personally very curious to hear more about, because I'm wondering how it could inform my own academic work more. Tonight we're mostly talking about economics, but you'll see that in doing so we'll also be looking at complex issues such as climate change, for example. Professor Coopers will talk more about that. So I'm very excited. I would like to encourage you to, while listening to the presentations and the video that was pre-recorded by Professor Hoogduin, to think about questions that you have for these professors that might apply to your own field, your own professional field. Because when we think of policies, the interesting thing becomes, of course, how do they affect what we do, and how can they inform the strategies that we're employing in our companies? So think about that and save your questions for the end, and we'll have a dialogue towards the end after having seen both presentations. So thank you very much. And our first speaker is Roland Coopers. Roland Coopers was already a little bit introduced, so he is indeed a consultant on complexity resilience and energy transition, and he'll tell you more about what those words exactly mean. He's by training a theoretical physicist, and is currently an associate fellow at the Smith School of the University of Oxford, which looks at enterprise and the environment. And he has written a book in 2014 along with David Colander called Complexity and the Art of Public Policy, which was published by Princeton University Press. And I think that it will be mostly this book that will have informed his presentation. And I look very much forward to hearing it. So please give it up for Professor Roland Coopers. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. So it's a good thing you're going to sit over there and do my slides. Yes. Thank you. It's part of moderating, you see. Thank you. If you could click to the next slide. So, as you heard, one of the things that I do is I teach every year in Singapore, and I tried to get some examples which are sort of vaguely related to the Netherlands, and what's more Dutch than bicycling. And I stay every year in a street called Bencoolen Street. And I'd never seen the street because every year I'm there, they were constructing a metro station. So it was a big construction site. But this year, for the first time, a couple of weeks ago, the street had been opened, and new for Singapore, they'd constructed a bicycle path. But they had done this in an extremely Singapore-esque way, as you can see, with about every 5 meters, there's an instruction for the bicyclist. And it's actually impossible to cycle on this thing because you would fall off, because the idea of bicycling, of course, you establish a certain momentum. But in a sense, you know, I use this example to draw out the question that I think underlies my story of this evening is, you know, what's the source of order for this flow of traffic for these bicycles, right? Is in Singapore, clearly there's the conviction often that the source of order is by imposing a set of rules, right? You tell people at every point what they need to do, and that's the way you're going to get at, you're going to have an orderly system. Now, of course, there are other ways to do that, right? Those who know the bicycle flows in Amsterdam realize that it's not the same philosophy. And there's a very different philosophy. But it's one that we have trouble understanding. You know, it'd be more difficult to explain, well, how does that exactly work? What's the source of order in that kind of a system? And I think this applies more generally. So, for example, if you're dealing with the education of children, so, you know, take another good Dutch example. If one of your children is caught with a joint, for example, and so what do, right? You can forbid this and say, you know, I will never allow, you can never do this again. And you sort of wonder, well, is that really going to work? Or you can find more contextual ways, you know, looking at their circle of friends, or, you know, there's another way you can deal with these things. And this is really, I think, the core of what I want to articulate is we have a very good idea of top-down order, but this other way of organizing is much less clear. And I think complexity and the insights of complexity science give us the tools to have a better and structural way of understanding that source of organization. And so I wrote this book a couple of years ago with David Collender, and David and I met at a conference in Berlin, which was about climate change. And we were both really uncomfortable at the narratives at this conference because, you know, the logic fell into two schools. You had people who say, oh, okay, you know, to deal with climate change, we need to have rules, and there needs to be regulations, and we need to impose things. And then there's another set of people who say, no, you know, we need to get the incentives right and let the market work, et cetera. And it falls out into those two sets of arguments. And we shared a plane ride back to Amsterdam, and we both said, you know, that's not the story. There is actually a different way of getting order and making progress on climate change, is by looking at it as a complex system and managing it that way. And by the end of this short 45-minute flight, we said, we're going to write a book about this. And, you know, I don't know how often but most often these things don't happen, but we actually did write the book. And it was a long effort. It took us quite a few years. But what it does is it tries to explain what the source of complexity science is, which is now several decades old. I mean, it's from the 80s, so it's something that's well established. But the bridge from complexity science to policy, and science ultimately, usually with a delay of many decades, informs how we think about policy and management. And we basically wanted to accelerate that connection. And so what I want to do today is first give you the world's shortest introduction to complexity, you know, because we don't have much time, but then really focus on 5 practical examples about where taking a complexity frame, or complexity view of a problem, a societal problem, a policy problem, leads to different solutions, a different way of tackling the problem than if you do not have that capacity. So the first thing is to go back to the word complexity. Complexity means something to all of you. You may have a complex relationship with your brother-in-law or with your colleague at the office or whatever, or maybe not, and that is a meaning of the word complex, and that's fine. But as you know, in natural language, words have multiple meanings, and I would just like to invite you to attribute a different, new meaning to the word. And you know, maybe this image can serve as an anchor. Plexus in Latin means to braid. And this is a photographer who took these wonderful pictures of African women with these incredibly elaborate braids. And so complex means with braids. Complexity is the science of braided or interconnected systems. And that is just, and you know, keep the other meaning of complex, but it's not the same. And because there's an emotional component to, you know, complex relationship and a complex problem. And complexity in this sense is a discipline that's about the science of interconnected systems. And the opposite of complex in a sense is complicated. So that's the contrast to make between a complicated system and a complex system. But sorry to dwell on that, but it's actually quite important that you separate these two meanings in your head. And hopefully, sometimes I use the image of Julia Timoshenko, but she's kind of gone out of fashion. So maybe this is now more. So what is complex in our world? Well, actually, many of the things that are of interest. It's very clear that the human brain is complex. Some years ago, maybe up to 10 years ago, people wrote about that, you know, our center of language was here, and our emotions were there, and our visual thing was there. And so, you know, the brain was built up of these different components. Today, we understand that you have to look at the brain as an entire network, and in order to understand how it functions. And you may know that the EU has provided €1 billion a research project to create a computer model of the human brain, which is very much about understanding the interconnections between the parts and modeling them. The economy is a complex system. There is no doubt about that. There is a problem in that macroeconomics, traditional macroeconomics, makes the three assumptions in general, the general equilibrium, representative agents, and perfect rationality for the economists amongst you. And those are exactly the three things you need to eliminate complexity from the complex system. And so that's a problem. So there's a real issue with macroeconomics, but there's no doubt, and people know this, and progress is being made in developing a complexity theory of macroeconomics. Traffic is a complex system. We'll come back to that. Social networks, there's all sorts of biological systems that are complex in this sense, and also animal flocks, etc. So it's all these systems that are spaghetti-like, right? There's lots of interconnections between them, and they are literally complex, and they have particular properties. Back to the Netherlands for a second is NVO, whom many of you will know is the Dutch organization that funds all scientific research. It's about €500 million a year, which provides the grants to all universities and research institutes, has made complexity one of its two main themes of research. And this is kind of a big deal, right? So in the Netherlands, the other one's big data, by the way, which ironically, in many ways, it contradicts complexity. It's quite an odd relationship between the two fields, but that may be for over a beer. But I did want to point out that it is, and this is the brochure, it's quite well written, it's obviously downloadable, and it describes how this is one of the really important themes for Dutch scientific research. And as it should be, because the Netherlands actually is an economy that is incredibly intertwined in itself and traditionally with the countries around it, etc. So to have a better understanding of interconnected systems is actually strategically important. Another country where this has become a strategic topic is Singapore, where notwithstanding jokes about their bicycle paths, there are actually plenty of people who really understand that this top-down logic is a problem. And there's a massive research program to try to develop a different understanding of governance and to try to develop an alternative to the top-down logic, which was the thing I tried to introduce in the beginning is, can we, as easily as intuitively we understand top-down logic and telling somebody what to do, and we kind of intuitively understand the other thing, but we don't really intellectually understand it well enough. And so to create the intellectual running room to be able to understand those problems better. So what I prepared for today are 5, and I could go on there, I could give you 15, but I think we have time for 5. It's 5 areas where looking at a policy or an area as a complex system yields a different solution and a different perspective than if you don't. And in many cases, this is a discussion we had just in the beginning, in many cases, the complexity solution is more efficient in an economic sense than the non-complexity solution. So this isn't a zero-sum game. If you're in an industry and a competitor manages to crack this and you don't, you lose. So this is, and the same is true for countries, etc. So there's actually a strategic imperative, I believe, to understand complex systems better and their connection to policy. So the first example is a concept called shared space. This is Mr. Monderman, a compatriot. Has anybody ever heard of Mr. Monderman? One person, great. He made the front page, is one of the few Dutch people who made the front page of the New York Times, which after all is all of our aspirations in life. He passed away a couple of years ago. Monderman developed this idea of shared space. And his idea was that if you look at traffic and you get rid of, so traffic is one of those systems that's managed top-down with rules, right? You have traffic lights, you have lines on the road, you have speed limits. The whole thing is imposed, right? The behavior of the participant in the traffic is managed with a set of fixed rules. Now, Monderman's idea is throw all of that out. If you have an interconnection in a city, get rid of the sidewalks, the bicycle paths, the lines on the road, everything. Just make it one big flat surface. And he said the consequence will be that traffic will be safer and more efficient, which is the two things we want out of traffic, right? We want it to be safe and flow better. Now, the first miracle is that he managed to convince the city authorities of a town to actually try this out. Because this is, and this isn't a trivial problem, is that with some of these complexity solutions, you may well be right, and in this case I think he is, but how do you have a discussion with the city authorities about this? You imagine Mr. Monderman shows up and the city authorities saying, well, how do we decide? We understand the top-down rules, so what education, what frames do we have to even do this? And imagine if you try this out and then an accident happens and a child is run over 3 months later, and the citizens are all outraged and they say, well, is Mr. Monderman on the front page of the New York Times? That doesn't work, right? So one of the problems with complex system solutions is that you need a culture of people who are able to argue and figure out whether these things work and when they work better. Now here's a little film of this in practice. This is in Austria. Now, traffic actually doesn't go this fast, but it's incredibly boring to look at traffic, so I speeded it up. But you get a sense of how this works, right? There's basically coordination between the participants, and that leads to a self-organization of the traffic. For those of you, next time you're in Amsterdam, or when you're in Amsterdam, behind the central station, there's an intersection where all the bicycle paths hit these ferries, and there's a big bicycle path behind the station, and the taxis and all the people coming out of the station. They created, very specifically, a Monderman shared space where basically there are no rules. It's just a blank space where just everybody kind of coordinates with each other. Now, a critical point to make that this is not, usually not in this audience, but usually in my audience, there would be somebody from India or China who say, well, in Mumbai, this doesn't work. It's a chaos and people run over and it doesn't work. This is not, and I repeat, this is not, I think in this country is an important argument to make. This is not an argument for kind of a fundamentalist, silly deregulation, right? Fewer rules is better. Because the reason this works is because there is a very rich set of rules in place. You have driver's licenses, you have a court system that can deal with people who actually do make an accident. There's a shared set of social norms. So this works in the Netherlands, it works in Austria. It does not work in India because there's a different set of shared social norms. The cars are checked. Some bicycles have light in the Netherlands. And so there are all these things that are in place, and it's because all those rules exist that self-organization, this form of self-organization, this complex system is possible. So the skill for the policymaker here is to understand that there is an alternative to top-down rules, but it requires a set of enabling rules that allow self-organization to happen. And that's a skill which I think many public servants or people in companies actually may not have today, but that's the kind of thing that complexity can bring. So the next example is about bird-brained pilots. KLM was kind enough to fly me over here, but the problem I would argue is the way they treat their pilots. Actually, pilots are treated pretty much like idiots in our air traffic control, right? They're told to fly in a certain pattern, and they get instructions. It's a centrally managed system, right? The flight control manages exactly what they do. So one of the interesting questions is, how do birds actually do this? Because if you can get, so you all know these images, right, of birds who take over either over the Hudson River or in the Netherlands over lakes, and they make these incredible shapes. But we know two things about these systems. The agents in them are bird-brained, and there's no choreographer, right? So how does it work? So this is another one of those examples of, how can we understand the source of order in this system in order to harness it? And what computer complexity scientists do is they simulate these kind of systems. And this is a simulation of birds called Boids, possibly because it's a scientist from Boston, but I'm not entirely sure. And the way this simulation works is they've discovered through experimentation that if you have a bird that follows 3 very simple local rules, 1, keep enough distance from the next bird, or else they crash, and there are other 2 rules that have to do with direction, then that's sufficient to simulate this flocking behavior. And that, in a sense, is something to wonder about. I mean, it's not trivial, right? It's really amazing that, but this is the way nature works, right? Is you have very simple rules that lead to complex behavior. And there's something really interesting going on in Europe, is that partly because people understand this now, the European airspace is being reformed. This is a massive project called the Single European Sky. What they're doing is they're giving power back to the pilots. They're taking power away from the central control. The control towers on the ground just have a monitoring role. And the pilots now, like birds, will coordinate more with each other in order to avoid collisions. According to simulations, this will save 10 to 15% of fuel in the European airspace because the flows are more efficient. But the question is what you feel in your stomach when you hear the story, right? Do you think, oh, that's great, the pilots are going to coordinate, it'll be fine? Or do you feel, well, actually, I'd rather have the control model because I think that's better. I'm convinced that's a better. And this bias is important, right? Because we're educated and our culture has taught us that control is the right solution. But actually, we now also know that that's actually not the case, that you can make systems more efficient, and this is an example. But this feeling in your stomach is actually quite important because we have great prejudices in this sense. The next example is the question is who innovates? What actually is innovation? And this is, interestingly enough, is a question that isn't asked very much, or at least I've not found satisfactory answers to it, with some very rare exceptions. And one of the things, again, to get back to a nice Dutch example, who invented the bicycle? Bicycle is something amazing, right? It's by far the most efficient mode of transportation that has ever been invented. It's 100 times more efficient than a car in terms of energy use, and it's actually much more efficient, 5 times more efficient than walking in terms of calories burned, etc. So who's the inventor of this incredible technology? Surely you know. No, and this is, I think, so if we go to the next slide, there is no inventor. What happened, it evolved through deductive tinkering. You know all these images of these weird bicycles in the 19th century. So people tried different concepts. Then they figured out which bits of it worked best, and they recombined them, and then came up with new designs and recombined them. So it's a classic evolution story, right? It's the same thing as what happened in nature: create diversity, find the best bits, recombine them, create more diversity, find the best bits, etc. And between about 1860 and 1890, the modern bicycle essentially evolved and has never changed. There's almost no difference between a bicycle from 1890 and a modern bicycle. There's a bit of carbon and expensive stuff, but the basic principles are the same. I think this is an important example because our culture it causes us, the big man theory of innovation, right? There's the Nobel Prize winner, or there's this, usually men, but there's this guy who invented something brilliant. But if you look at it through this complexity lens and you see this kind of recombination, that reframes the idea of invention, because it actually isn't about the brilliant individual. It's about the capacity to diversify, to recombine, to select, and to identify successful things. A very different process. And so Brian Arthur, who is one of the main complexity scientists, one of the main early complexity economists, wrote this beautiful little book. If you're interested in innovation, I would really recommend it. It's a very thin, I'll recommend a thick book afterwards, but a thin, my own book's not that thick, by the way, but he wrote a very short book. It's called The Nature of Technology, What It Is and How It Evolves. And it's a real aha. It really describes, with all sorts of examples, the same process as with the bicycle, is that there are no new ideas. It's essentially always a recombination of existing things put together in a new way. And seeing it that way means that you actually would manage innovation processes in a dramatically different way, but also reward it in a different way, et cetera. So to understand that this is not just a social thing, you know, we have to reward teams, et cetera, but it's actually the very essence of the innovation process is different than what we had imagined in the past. So innovation's recombination, essentially, diversification and then recombination. The fourth example is about networks. So networks matter, right? We all know about networks, social media, all this kind of stuff. So let me give you one example of a network. So how many cells in your body, you here, what percentage of the cells in your body is human, of human DNA? 10%. You have 0% human DNA in your body. Get this man out of here. Any other guesses? 80%. 80. 3. It's 10, actually. But this is quite, I hope you find quite extraordinary, is that if you think of what is me, it's only 10% human cells. 90% of the cells in your bodies are non-human, and it's the cells in your gut, the bacteria on your skin, and all these kinds of things that have an incredible role, we now know, in managing your own system. This isn't just, they're not just servants. They actually really are part of the way your things work. So back one. Sorry. So for example, you have 60% of your cells in common with your dog, which may give you a different perspective when you see your dog next time. And so this is a picture of the network of interconnection between species, of the distance in terms of the amount of cells they have in common. And these kind of networks actually underpin a lot of our reality. And I wanted to go through the next example. Since we're at Baker McKenzie, I wanted to have, and in honor of Madeleine, have a legal example. This is a science paper that was published in 2015. They did a network analysis of the EU legal code. There are 50,000 laws in the EU code, which is not that much. If you count the US number, it's a much bigger number. And they mapped the network structure. So laws are connected if they refer to each other. And if you then map the network structure, it has extraordinary mathematical properties. It has the same mathematical properties as these biological systems, as the cells that interconnect different species. Mathematically, they're called scale-free networks. I'll pass on the maths of that. But they're a particular type of network that have specific properties. For example, they are resilient against random attacks and very sensitive to target attacks. And that's a property of the EU legal code, for example, that we weren't aware of. And so if you're a populist and want to take down the EU, this is quite an important insight. But at the same time, it also explains why with lawmakers making occasionally random, silly laws, the system still holds, because it's actually a remarkably resilient system. And again, so this is an example where looking at this as a complex system, and networks, these kinds of networks are complex systems, you see a different reality, and you would actually manage it and look at it in a different way than if you were not aware of this. The last example I just wanted to come back to, because it's so topical, is the issue of inequality. Who has read this book? This is a thick book. Oh, great. I highly recommend. It's 900 pages of economic statistics, and it's beautifully written. I read it by the pool one summer in 3 days. It's really quite extraordinary. And Piketty, basically, the 15-second summary is he basically says, Inequality in the world up to the world wars was that the top 1% had 3/4 of everything. This was true for the Romans, it was true in the 19th century. It stopped being true in the 50s. We had a much more equal world. Since the 1980s, we're marching back at rapid pace to the original inequality. We're heading back towards historic inequality where the top 1% have 3/4 of everything. What does this have to do with complexity? Well, it makes a huge difference whether inequality is a system property like this traffic, right? Like this self-organization of traffic that's attributed to the system and the rules that are set around it. Or whether you frame it as saying, well, you know, these are individuals, they're great entrepreneurs, and therefore they make lots of money, and it's rightful that they have that. So viewing viewing this system as having this property of inequality that's actually not, like the bird flocking, that's actually not so much associated with the talent of the individuals, but as a system property, means you both the ethics and the politics around inequality become dramatically different than if you look at it as a very linear thing that's tied to the merits of the individual. And there's enough evidence actually that this is the case, inequality, and that's why we're going back to this inequality of the 19th century. And nobody has that as their goal, right? Nobody said we would like to get back the inequality that the Romans had, but that's what we're doing de facto because we fail to recognize the network nature and the complex nature of the property of inequality. With that, I just want to conclude. This is, in a sense, kind of the summary of the book that I wrote with David Collender on complexity and the art of public policy. And the argument is you can look at all these problems, and we saw some of them, education, climate change, inequality, all the problems that we worry about, through this control lens, right? You know, what are, and particularly in economics, you know, what are the control measures we can apply to them? We can look at it through a market fundamentalist frame. Oh, get rid of all the rules and make it all, the freer it is, the better it will be. Or we can look at it through this complexity frame. And in each different frame, you see a different set of solutions. And our politics are typically consists of these two frames, and our argument is we need to add this third frame because it actually opens up a different solution set. And then the question is, which frame is the right one for this problem at this time? So we're not arguing that you should always look at things as complex systems. And I found I have to say this twice because people just generally hear, oh, you know, this guy must think that complexity is the best thing since sliced bread. It isn't. But it's actually a really important thing to add to your tool set so that you can consciously choose which approach you take to a particular problem. And it will lead to different solutions. And this is the small publicity at the end anyway. So that's basically where I wanted to leave it for today. Thank you.
I think we're setting up the video of, I think you are setting up the video of Lex Hoogduin. Yeah, now you know what it's like to be behind the laptop. So our next speaker is Professor Lex Hoogduin. Like Roland, he has one leg in the academy and one leg in, shall we say, real life. That is extensive experience in the corporate sector. And he's unfortunately not able to be here tonight, but he did record a video, which is, I think, about 30 minutes. So Professor Hoogduin, he is among other things, a professor of economics at the University of Groningen, where he focuses on complexity and uncertainty in financial markets and financial institutions, as well as a professor of economics at the University of Amsterdam. He's also a former board member of the Nederlandse Bank, the Dutch bank, and chief economist of Robeco and chairman of the Global Complexity Network. Are we ready to roll? Okay, well, he can't hear us, but give it up for Lex Hoogduin.
Too many rules make you incapable of reacting on sudden events.
Constantly look for flaws in reasoning and actions.
We are living in a fascinating yet complex and thus uncertain world. a world that has to deal with social complexity and uncertainty and requires a new paradigm. Complexity is about data, information and knowledge that is constantly produced, shaped and reshaped and flowing between individuals and organizations. Social complexity is about networks of large numbers of interacting individuals responding to their environment, creating resilience and increasing adaptive capabilities. The future cannot be predicted. It can be imagined.
In a turbulent landscape, we have to see, think and act differently.
It's not about stability, but about resilience and adaptive capacity.
GloComNet is an unpartisan global self-organizing platform and network and cuts through traditional disciplines. It connects different perspectives and disciplines and merges virtual and physical realities, thereby creating new realities. It's about leadership and entrepreneurship, strength and limitations of self-organization. GloComNet helps you to act effectively in a complex and uncertain world as entrepreneur, manager, policymaker, or privately.
When every financial works with the same set of rules, we actually have a serious problem.
Xanders is a leading independent consulting firm with 3 areas of expertise: treasury, risk management, and corporate finance. Since its establishment in 1994, the company has grown into an international-based niche player with offices in 4 European countries. As a substantive authority, Xanders follows all the developments in the market closely and applies knowledge in an innovative manner, sustainable solutions, and added value.
Not the strongest balance sheet, nor the largest firm will survive. Only those able to adapt.
GloComNet and Xanders recognize and acknowledge their mutual values, their vision of the future, and what complexity as science can do for their customers.
We have to build capacity to cope with the complexities around us.
Look before you leap, but don't forget to leap.
GloComNet, its cooperation with the University College Groningen and Xanders as a market party on the other hand, indicates that dealing with social complexity and uncertainty will dominate many international agendas in the coming decades. The strategic cooperation between parties is therefore a logical step in further development of the parties.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great honor to have been invited to speak at this NAF seminar. But very much to my regret and due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm unable to attend in person. So I would like via this channel to speak about governance, both private and public, and complexity. Many companies, governments and organizations, and also people individually, feel that traditional tools, methods of control frequently are not as effective in current circumstances as they were in the past. Whether it is, for example, quantitative risk management, setting a precise strategy in the private sector, or, for example, targeting a certain level of inflation via steering interest rates by central banks in the public sector. And how to deal with issues like climate change, cybersecurity, traffic safety, migration flows, development of cities, regions and countries, worldwide poverty and personal development. This problem of felt lack of control seems to be related to increased globalization and digitization of our world. Or in other words, it is related to high interconnectedness, combined with realizing that the future is uncertain. And my claim here today is it has indeed to do with the fact that the world is complex and the future is uncertain. However, and that's where the tension is, we look at the world as if it is not complex and as if it is not uncertain. we are using planning and control techniques which assume a simple world, where uncertainty doesn't matter. We need to act in the world, take decisions and make choices on the basis of another paradigm. A paradigm that assumes complexity and the existence of uncertainty. What I will do in the remaining of this talk is to first define complexity and uncertainty, and then explain what taking these phenomena, complexity and uncertainty, seriously implies for being effective in today's world. And effective meaning being able to seize opportunities and to be able to cope with and respond to threats. I will, in that context, discuss 5 important strengths and 5 policy principles for acting in a complex and uncertain world. But as said, first to the definitions of complexity and uncertainty. First, what do I mean by complexity? First element of it is that we have to do with a great number of heterogeneous, interacting individuals who are also responding to each other and to their environment. So complex human systems are adaptive systems. A second element of complexity is, and human complexity is, that it is impossible to collect centrally all the dispersed knowledge and information that is needed to know to determine the actual state of the system at any point in time. So that's the definition of complexity. Let's look at a short video about an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is also a complex system and also a complex adaptive system. Just to make more clear, to show what a complex system is. So after having talked about complexity, let me now move on to uncertainty. And uncertainty has to be distinguished from risk. And let me first describe what risk is, how we define a situation of risk. And a situation of risk is a situation in which we know all the potential or possible outcomes of a certain action or of a certain decision. And the most simple example is flipping a coin. Flipping a coin has two potential outcomes. It can be heads or it can be tails. You don't know in advance which outcome it will be, but it's definitely one of these two. If you are in a situation of uncertainty, distinguished from risk, you do not know all the potential outcomes of a certain action or a certain decision. Now the point is that part of the human condition is that we live in a situation and we have to take decisions and we have to act in a situation of uncertainty rather than in a situation of risk. And this is inescapable. It's part of the human condition. Because we cannot know now what we will discover or what will be discovered in the future. But future discoveries will impact the outcome of decisions and actions that we take now. And therefore, by definition, the future is uncertain rather than risky. Let's again look at a short video which elaborates a little bit on what uncertainty means in real life.
See,
Let's
understand this. See, this is all it is. There are many uncertainties. I may be very good driver, but still I can hit something or something can hit me. Always this chance is there, do you understand? This chance is always there with every aspect of life, not just with road. So the problem is, because you don't have the courage to handle it, you want to know what will happen tomorrow. If you want to know what will happen tomorrow, one thing that will happen to you is, you will not play today's game well. Yes. And essentially you are a match fixer. That is, you want to know the result before you play the game, you're a match fixer, isn't it? Right now it is for match fixing in India there is a 10-year imprisonment. So before you get married, you want to know whether you live joyfully or not. Arey? You have to get married, you have to take responsibility for each other and see that it works. There is no magic to it.
Now, having defined complexity and uncertainty, the question is, what does it mean if we take a paradigm in which we look at the world from the perspective of the assumption that the world is complex and uncertain? What insights can be derived from that as a basis for our action in today's world, in the modern world as it is? And I would restrict myself to what I think is the most important insight from that complexity paradigm. And that insight is that there is always potential surprise. There's always potential for positive surprise, let's say opportunities, but also for negative surprise. Let's call it threats. There's always the potential for mistakes, there's always the potential for errors. So that's the main insight that follows from looking at the world through the lens of complexity. as said earlier, there are 5 strengths that can help you as a person, as a team, as a department, a company, a government, to be effective in the modern world, in the world as it is, complex and uncertain. The first strength is alertness. And alertness in this context is the capacity to detect surprises. So the paradigm says that there is potential for surprise. Alertness is a capacity to then be also able to find surprises. The second strength to develop in the modern world and to be effective in the modern world is resiliency. And that is the capacity to remain viable, to survive negative surprises. Third capacity is adaptivity. That's the capacity to respond to surprises. The fourth strength is creativity. And in this context, creativity means the capacity to generate surprises, the capacity to co-shape the future. And finally, an important strength is being entrepreneurial. Defined, again, through the complexity lens, as a capacity to pursue objectives by continuously following a feedback process of planning, executing, reviewing, and adapting. Planning, executing, reviewing, and adapting, and so on and so forth, permanently. These are 5 important strengths that help you in the modern, complex, and uncertain world. Now note that stability, often mentioned as an objective of policies, is not mentioned, has not been mentioned by me as a strength. And I would even go a step further. Stability is not even always a desired outcome, because resilience and adaptivity mean that you sometimes have to change. You have to adapt to surprises. You have to cope with them. And that's almost the opposite of stability. Let me now zoom in a little bit more, or look at it from the policy perspective, and economic policy in particular. And in that context, the alternative paradigm, the complexity paradigm, or a paradigm in which you take complexity and uncertainty seriously, leads to, again, 5 principles. 5 principles for effective, for desirable policy in a complex and uncertain world. The first principle is what I would call the principle of modesty. And that principle is derived from the work of the great economist Friedrich von Hayek. And basically that principle says that you should never pursue objectives that are beyond your reach, that you really cannot achieve. It says, don't try to achieve in a complex world very specific and precise outcomes, but create conditions which make the achievement of your objectives more likely. So that's the first principle. Try to create the right conditions rather than to achieve specific outcomes. Second important policy principle is the principle of do no harm. And perhaps people working in the area of medicine recognize this principle because it's a principle that's often found in medical oaths. And some even claim that it goes back to Hippocrates centuries ago. What does that principle say, and what does that principle mean? It basically says, first of all, that you should be aware that you know very little about the actual day-to-day and detailed functioning of a complex system. And a human body is also a complex system. And an economy, of course, certainly is, and society certainly is a complex system. There's very little that you can know in detail of the actual functioning of such a system, and you should be aware of that. Secondly, as we have already seen, in such a system there is adaptive capacity. And so this principle says, give that adaptive capacity room to operate. Don't hinder it by your policy actions. Don't do more harm than good. Don't be a source of unpredictability yourself. And the yourself here is the policy maker or the politician. So that's the do no harm principle. The next principle can be based on two statements. And both of them come from the well-known, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. The first statement I'm referring to is a statement that comes from his book, A Tract on Monetary Reform. And that statement, it's a famous statement, is in the long run, we are all dead. Second statement, coming from his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, is don't attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain. So what does that mean? What do these two quotes, what do they mean if we bring them together? First of all, in the long run we are all dead statement basically says, if you have a problem today, do not assume that it will automatically solve itself, but act today and don't wait until the long run. He also said, to illustrate this further, if you are in a storm on a lake and you have to cope with that, it doesn't help you very much if somebody tells to you, just wait, because we know that after the storm the lake is quiet again. You have to cope with it now. You have to do something now. The second quote, that you should not attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain, basically says that of course you have to look ahead in planning, but you can overdo focusing on the long run. So be modest, do no harm, take into account that in the long run we are all dead, and don't attach too much weight to matters which are very uncertain, are the first three principles. The next one is coming from Hazlitt. And basically from his little booklet, Economics in One Lesson. And basically what he says there is, look beyond the immediately visible impact of an action. So look beyond the immediate impact and also look beyond the visible impact. That means that you should always be prepared also for unintended consequences. And again, of course, then we are back again at what is characteristic of a complex adaptive system. That is that there are always surprises, which is very much linked also to unintended consequences. Fifth and final principle, there are always trade-offs. There are no free lunches. To achieve something, you always have to give up something else which you cannot achieve. And this is a principle that comes from, again, an economist, Milton Friedman. So I've given 5 strengths and I've given 5 principles. And what is needed is that you have to develop these strengths and you have to act according to these principles to be effective in today's but also tomorrow's world as it is. These 5 principles and 5 strengths provide an interesting basis for discussing, and I also believe criticizing, several of the current policies that we see in the world, and for criticizing and discussing several crucial problems that the world is facing at the moment. I would have loved, for example, to discuss climate policy from this perspective. I would have loved to have discussed policies of central banks like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank from this perspective, or financial regulation. Unfortunately, that is not possible given my time constraints. So let me just mention a couple of points about ECB policy in particular. I do think that if you look at current policies from the European Central Bank, that you could argue that is a policy that is violating the first 2 policy principles that I mentioned. The ECB policy is not modest. Why not? Because the ECB has set a very precise target for inflation, 1.8% or 1.9% per year. And that's simply something that you cannot achieve in a complex world. It is also violating the do no harm principle. It is buying huge amounts of government debt via this so-called QE program in order to bring inflation to the level of 1.8, 1.9% that I mentioned earlier. Current inflation is around 0.5% point lower than what the ECB tries to achieve. That in itself doesn't do a lot of harm, but the policies that the ECB is following, these QE policies, are quite risky. They have a lot of risks in themselves. They may create another financial crisis. They lead to postponement of adjustments by governments. They may hamper growth. They may trigger inflation at a certain point in time. Quite large risks. And you take these risks apparently only to increase the actual inflation by a couple of tens of percentage points. So I have the feeling that the ECB is indeed in such a complex system as the European economy is indeed doing more harm than good and violating that important principle of policy in a complex system. There's much more to say about central bank policy, and certainly also, of course, about the other policies that I mentioned, like climate policy. But I think I have to leave that potentially to the panel discussion later on in this seminar. So let me conclude by wishing you not only an enjoyable but also a fruitful seminar and also ball tomorrow. And thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. I think we have time for a couple of quick questions pertaining to the applicability of complexity theory and economics. I'd like to invite to the stage back again Roland Coopers and also Bart van Ark. Bart van Ark is the Executive Vice President and Chief Economist of the Conference Board, and both gentlemen will have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So feel free to ask, yes.
You mentioned at some point the various frames through which you can look at a problem and how you then come up with different perspective to figure out where the answers might lie. And one of the examples that you used was how you look at inequality through a complexity lens and therefore come up with different insights about what you might do about it. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, if you view, and there are models that actually underpin the plausibility of that, of income inequality or asset inequality as an emergent property of a system, then you look at what are the mechanisms, like the bird flocking, what are the rules that lead to this emergent properties, and we've changed something in our rule set around the 1980s that we're seeing a dramatic increase in inequality. And I would argue that that wasn't a purposeful or conscious choice. I don't think anybody has argued, we want to go back to 19th century inequality. That's our ideal. But nevertheless, that almost by accident has happened. And currently, my view is in most countries, there are very few, I don't think there's a single political party that has a target for inequality that says, the desired level of inequality in our society is X. And by the way, we believe that these are the enabling mechanisms that lead to inequality. So it's a different way of viewing it than saying, it's just an outcome of the talent and and it's also a different view from saying, okay, we need to tackle it, so let's just tax it away and let's just use taxes to move money around. That undoubtedly works, but that's the top-down solution. The market solution is saying, this is just, it's just how things go, and et cetera. It's just part of a natural system. And the complexity frame solution would be saying, listen, this is an emergent property of this underlying system. We need to understand the dynamics of the system and what are the elements that are driving this inequality, and can we make some tweaks to that so that we get a different inequality as an outcome. Yeah, so one of the things, clearly social mobility matters, access to education, and so I don't want to pretend. This is a massive problem in society, right? So it's not simple to change, but part of it is getting a more level playing field. The Economist has elaborately written about how, particularly in the US, but in many countries, actually competition has dramatically decreased. So the antitrust authorities have basically failed to guarantee sufficient competition, and so there's a whole series of these elements that you would go after. But it is a tough problem, and it would take some serious study. But my point is not to come up with those are just examples. I don't want to say, oh, this is how you do it. But just to suggest that if you look at it as a complex problem, you actually tackle it in a different way than through, the top-down taxation model or the market fundamentalist, where this is just an outcome of the natural system.
Thanks. Winfred Knibler, I'm an antitrust practitioner at Freshfields. So I think you repeatedly referred to this dichotomy, as you stated it, between the top-down solution and the market-based solutions, and there the theory of complexity would be, so to say, third way, which would acknowledge the also interaction between systems, and that's underestimated perhaps in one of the two scenarios which were previously dominant. I was just wondering, listening to this, whether the developments during the 90s, where you had a number of so-called modern social democratic politicians like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, also in the Netherlands, Wim Kok, who pronounced to really articulate a third way in policy making, where they tried, in fact, to accommodate market solutions within a smart regulatory context. Whether that, as such, wasn't an early example, perhaps, of complexity theory in practice, but also whether or not, at the same time, that led to a number of the inequality problems as a result of the fact that markets were in fact stimulated within a proper regulatory context as the third way proponents saw it, and whether in fact this whole theory of complexity doesn't resonate a lot with the third way of Tony Blair and others.
Yeah, so the answer is no, I don't think so, because I think it's a very good question, but the third way to me is is an interesting idea in politics, but it's essentially a muddle of things. It's more muddling up market fundamentalist and state control rather than having a clear idea about a system, a dynamic of system that would lead you to different kind of solutions. The other thing is that they very clearly said this is the right way and the other things are the wrong way, whereas I go to pains to saying that the complexity solutions aren't necessarily the right solution. It's just you have to have the skill to be able to consider them in the first place and then have a debate about them. So I think it's a very interesting question, but I think it's a very different thing than the third way of Clinton and Blair, et cetera, which were a complete intellectual muddle. And much in politics is a muddle, so that's not my problem. But I think it's really a really different story.
But I think both questions lead me to a more fundamental question, and it is whether the sort of third alternative, basically government, markets, and complexity, whether that complexity idea really is a different idea. I think you gave some fantastic examples, which I completely buy into. But when we talk about inequality, or we talk about social policy, or combining markets, and so on, the question is, in the end, if we're not just coming back to two systems. What I really worry about, your system of complexity, you're talking about we need to do something, we need to change something. Well, markets sort of take care of a lot of things, and if markets don't take care of it and it goes wrong, government comes in. What I worry about with your complexity description is that it is actually opening the back door for government to get back into the driving seat, and I worry enormously about that.
Why do you worry about it?
Well, because I think we have enough examples of government being in the driving seat. So we have some not so subtle ways, like dictatorships and communism and crony capitalism. We have some more subtle examples, like rent-seeking and vested interest and so on. So this idea that the system will take care of itself, I love that example behind the central station. I actually saw that too, thought it was very interesting. But I still need to make a huge mental leap to understand that we can organize our society and the complexity of our problems by just letting it take care of itself. So my question really is, what's new here? And is there really something new here compared to theories we've had in the past? As an economist, we had the evolutionary economics. A lot of what I hear here today, particularly when I hear Lex talking, I've studied all that when I did economic history back in the 1980s. This was evolutionary economics. So what exactly is new here? That's one thing. But the more important thing is that I think I'm not clear yet how this will lead to a fundamentally different way of organizing our society. And if we don't think clearly about that, the end of the road, at the end of the day, we're ending up with more government. and I'm not sure I want that.
Yeah. So look, I don't want to claim to have the answer to every problem but just a couple of comments. There is a revolution in science happening, and that, I think, Robert Dijkgraaf, to stay with a Dutch root, articulates it. We spent 200 years understanding the pieces of reality. We'll spend the next 200 years understanding how they hang together. And this is a profound, and this is why NVO is looking at this, a profound revolution in our scientific world. It's a slow motion revolution. It's not a consultancy trend or some thing that will come and go. And these revolutions actually ultimately over time reframe the way we understand the world. And so I think that's why this is actually a really big thing. The second thing is that it's very clear that in a complexity frame, you would look at a more powerful government, but a smaller government. It would be a government that actually does many fewer things, but they would actually have a hell of a lot more impact. So one of the reasons that, and sort of the tongue-in-cheek examples you gave about communism, et cetera, those are essentially blatant control models. And the idea of complexity is that it's about a subtle adjustments. And where this works well is I do quite a lot of work for the Rockefeller Foundation, who have this program called 100 Resilient Cities, and resilience is a complexity idea. When in a city, this debate about the market versus the state doesn't exist. Nobody in their right mind would say, oh, leave everything in the city to the market. That doesn't make any sense. Nor does the mayor get up in the morning and shout out instructions to the citizenry about what they need to do. In cities, people understand that it's a complex system and you need to tweak and you need to do all these things. But somehow when we get to the national level, all of a sudden we believe that there's this dichotomy and that's the market.
Even at city level, it's markets and government who sort of interact. I mean, there's also a little bit of a caricature here of economists just thinking that markets are doing everything. I mean, most economists, except maybe a few living in a completely ivory tower, know that there is a complex world out there, that governments and markets need to interact with each other. So what is it exactly that is added by bringing in the complexity concept? See the system take care of itself, and that's the part that I don't see, except behind the central station. There I do see it.
But it doesn't take care of itself, right? It's in the book we call this ecosystem design. I mean, this whole idea that markets somehow magically adjust themselves, markets are social constructs. They're not natural systems. So the world, nature takes care of itself as a complex system. Social systems are not. They're designed and they have rules, and therefore the design of the rules makes a hell of a difference. And so, in this example of inequality, we have changed the rules in order that drives us down this road of much greater inequality, which I don't think is an explicitly desired outcome of anybody particularly. And actually, I don't think economists are, there are brilliant complexity economists, David Collender actually being one of them, but there is very little, there is at master's level or at graduate level, there's no attention paid to complex systems or complexity economics today. At PhD level, and at research level, there's beautiful work going on, but the bulk of the economists that get spit out of universities into policy have no idea about complexity.
I think we have time for one more question. Hang on.
So I work in technology, and you see a lot of trends in machine learning and deep learning, and I was just wondering if there's any influence of that on public policy making.
I don't know. What do you think?
Well, what I'm asking is, you've talked about theories to explain complex systems, and now there's a question about how we should manage it, markets or organization. And what I'm seeing in technology is that these complex systems are self-learning and manage themselves. So if you talk about a third way, I'm seeing technology, and then the same thing when you talk about shared spaces. I see in technology, I see open source communities who manage on an equal level systems that outcompete managed systems.
Yeah. So there's no doubt that in technology there are brilliant applications of of complexity. I mean, literally, the theories of complexity are applied there in a great way. There's, you know, the new algorithm that plays Go, for example, is now, you know, at 10 or 15 times the world player because it has this self-learning things. But the critical thing when you get to policy questions actually is understanding the interaction with social norms. And I think that's, you know, the whole technology world misses that completely. And you know, our societies are formed around social norms, and technology interacts with norms. There are also emergent properties of systems, etc. So you need a much greater understanding of the interaction between the technology systems and the societal systems in order to really make progress. I think they're you know, wonderful little point solutions that are given by technology, but I don't think it's, you know, they're nowhere near at a level of power to make a difference to society, I would think, at this time.
Can you maybe illustrate one interesting example? Self-driving cars. I always love to do this experiment when I talk about technology and ask people in the room, you know, how long do you think it will take before 99% of cars on the road here on Fifth Avenue are self-driving, completely self-driving? And the answers differ from 2 years from now to never. And really where this comes in, when you think about these three sort of concepts, I think there's a role for government, there's a role for markets, and there's definitely a role for self-organization in the complexity system. How do you think, can you sort of describe an example how you think this will play out? And why, and maybe also answer the question when you think there will be 90% self-driving cars?
Yeah. It's funny you should ask, because I'm actually writing a book about this.
Okay, all right, well, I didn't know that.
And it's about halfway done, so okay. Let me not give away.
You have to stay for another half hour now. So.
No. Let me not give away the plot. Okay. I think it will happen. I mean, I have a self-driving car. I no longer drive on the highways, right? And it works perfectly well, and it's incredibly relaxing, and I look forward to the day that it'll work. So I think this will go relatively quickly. But the thing with so you know, I would say between 5 and 10 years. But the thing, the thing that will happen is that, you know, drivers in the U.S. is the single largest job category for people with no college education. So yes, 1.8 million truck drivers, right? Exactly, and which is, sorry, all right. So it's a big. Do we agree it's big? Right, bigly. And so it's the social consequences of that are going to, you know, technology also typically has increasing returns to scale, so it leads to greater inequality, etc. So the bigger issue, if you look at self-driving cars, is the knock-on consequences to the other social systems. I think that's much more difficult to figure out. That they're going to be self-driving on Fifth Avenue, sure, I think that'll happen in a couple of years. But it's the interaction, a complexity policymaker will try to understand, you know, what actually, you know, this is, I think, is a profound change in terms of many things, in terms of accident rates and all these kinds of things. But is understanding the interconnections with the other system is the hard thing. To predict when it will happen actually isn't that difficult. You know, I don't think it's that far away. The technology is mature. So it's a question of...
So some people are saying never. I've done this test multiple times. Some people say never because they say the government will never allow it, for the simple reason that, you know, if you get a very simple example, the car drives on the road, somebody's crossing the road, the kid is crossing the road, the car now has to decide whether to run over the kid or drive into the lamp pole. The government will not allow that decision to be taken by a machine. The government will want to regulate that, and as a result, some people are saying, I'm not saying I agree with that, but some people are saying, therefore, the regulators will come in and will never allow it.
I don't think that the insurance...
For the same way that pilots are still sitting in a plane, wasting their time because we don't need them there.
No, actually, we're actually going to need them more. If you look at the European airspace control...
Yeah, your system they do. But some people say you don't need them at all because it's completely automated.
Yeah. So anyway, so, you know, so my main message is, you know, look at the interconnection between these systems, because it's the social consequence, and this is the social consequence of these things that actually are bigger, because it's going to drive, you know, more inequality. It's going to drive, very large social problems, and those in the end will lead to political transformations, essentially as what we're seeing in the US today. I mean, the populist movements are driven by some of these technologies and some of these policies. And it's the understanding of how all these things interacting and having a frame that also enables you to argue about this, is to be able to have an argument about why Monderman's thing is a good idea and when it isn't, about when you should use genetic algorithms for logistic planning and when you should use linear programming algorithms. So it's the ability for policymakers and business people to be able to have debates about complexity solutions, not blindingly accepting them, but having the skill to be able to consider them and possibly reject them. But today, I think there aren't enough people who are able to weigh these solutions and put them into our policy practice.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here this evening. Give a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
For this provocative conversation. Thank you all very much for being here, and I think we still have some drinks in the back and some snacks, so feel free to stick around a little longer. And again, thank you very much for being here.